In the spring of 1941, the British Army faced a problem that seemed almost impossible to solve. Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps were tearing across North Africa, and Allied intelligence knew something terrifying. The Germans were very, very good at gathering information. They had spies everywhere, reconnaissance planes constantly photographing Allied positions, and an intelligence network that seemed to know every troop movement before it happened. The British needed to hide their actual military strength, but in the vast, open desert of North Africa, there was simply nowhere to hide thousands of men and tanks. That's when someone came up with an idea so audacious, so completely insane, that it just might work. What if they didn't hide their troops at all? What if instead, they created troops that didn't exist? This is the story of the Ghost Army, or more accurately, multiple ghost armies that fooled the most sophisticated military machine the world had ever seen. This is about a deception so elaborate, so meticulously crafted, that entire German divisions would be sent chasing shadows while real Allied forces struck where the enemy least expected. The British operation started with a man named Dudley Clarke, a lieutenant colonel who understood something fundamental about warfare that most generals overlooked. War, he realized, wasn't just about firepower and strategy. It was about perception. If you could make the enemy believe you were strong where you were weak, and weak where you were strong, you could win battles without firing a shot. Clarke established what would become known as a force, a special unit dedicated entirely to military deception. This wasn't just about lying to the enemy. This was about creating an entirely fictional order of battle, complete with fake units, fake commanders, fake radio traffic, and fake equipment that looked so real, German intelligence officers would swear under oath they were genuine. The first challenge was physical deception. In the desert, German reconnaissance planes flew over Allied positions constantly, photographing everything. So a force began constructing dummy tanks, dummy artillery, and even dummy supply depots. But these weren't crude fakes that would fool no one. These were sophisticated pieces of engineering, designed by stage magicians, artists, and set designers recruited specifically for their ability to create convincing illusions. They built tanks out of canvas and wood frames that could be assembled by a handful of men in a few hours. From the air, at the altitude German reconnaissance planes flew, they were indistinguishable from the real thing. They even created tracks in the sand behind them to simulate movement. They positioned these fake tanks in careful formations, exactly as real tank units would deploy, because they knew German intelligence officers were trained to spot irregularities. But the physical deception was only half the equation. Clarke understood that the Germans would cross-reference what they saw with what they heard. So a force created an entirely fictional signals network. Radio operators would transmit fake messages using the communication patterns and call signs of units that existed only on paper. They'd send supply requests, weather reports, casualty figures, and operational orders for divisions that had no soldiers, no tanks, and no commanders. What made this brilliant was the attention to detail. Real military units have a rhythm to their communications. There are patterns, mistakes, personality quirks of individual radio operators that intelligence analysts learn to recognize. So the fake radio operators developed their own quirks. One might tap the Morse code key with a distinctive rhythm. Another might make characteristic spelling errors. The Germans were listening to what they believed was incompetent radio discipline. What they were actually hearing was theater. The operation reached its peak before the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery was planning a major offensive against Rommel's forces, but he needed to hide where and when the main attack would come. A force launched Operation Bertram, perhaps the most elaborate military deception of the North African campaign. They built an entire fake supply depot in the southern sector, complete with dummy vehicles, fake fuel dumps, and even a fake water pipeline. German reconnaissance watched this pipeline being constructed day by day, exactly as a real one would be built. What they didn't know was that it was completely non-functional, designed only to be photographed from the air. Meanwhile, in the northern sector where the real attack would come, they disguised actual tanks as supply trucks using specially designed covers. They hid artillery pieces under fake truck bodies. And the radio traffic told a story of a major offensive being prepared in the south, scheduled for early November. Rommel bought it completely. He repositioned his forces, strengthening his southern flank and placing his reserves where they could respond to the fake southern attack. When Montgomery struck in the north on October 23, the Germans were caught completely off guard. It was one of the turning points of the entire North African campaign. But the Americans were watching, and they were taking notes. In 1944, the United States Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, though that official name was deliberately bland and boring. This was the American Ghost Army, and it would take the lessons learned in North Africa and elevate them to an art form. The 23rd was unlike any other unit in the American military. It was composed of just over 1,100 men, but among them were fashion designers, artists, actors, sound engineers, and radio operators. Some had worked in Hollywood. Others came from advertising agencies on Madison Avenue. They weren't traditional soldiers. They were illusionists in uniform. What they carried with them across Europe was extraordinary. They had inflatable rubber tanks that could be blown up like massive balloons. They had inflatable artillery pieces, inflatable trucks, even inflatable airplanes. These weren't toys. They were precisely engineered decoys that, from a distance or from the air, looked absolutely real. The sonic deception equipment was perhaps the most innovative technology they used. They had recorded the sounds of actual armor columns on the move. The rumble of tank engines, the clanking of treads, the grinding of gears, the shouted orders of tank commanders. These recordings were played through speakers mounted on half-tracks that could project sound up to 15 miles under the right atmospheric conditions. Imagine being a German soldier on a quiet night, hearing what sounds like an entire armored division moving into position nearby, when in reality it's a handful of men with speakers. But just like their British counterparts, the Americans understood that the deception had to be layered. Visual plus audio plus radio plus personal behavior. When the Ghost Army set up a fake headquarters, they didn't just plant inflatable tanks nearby. They had men wearing the patches of the unit they were impersonating going into local towns, visiting bars, chatting with locals, maybe letting slip a few careless words about where they were headed next, knowing that German intelligence had agents everywhere. They even had vehicles drive repeated loops through towns, the same trucks going around and around through different streets, creating the impression of a massive convoy passing through. Meanwhile, actual combat units would be quietly moving into position miles away, under radio silence, their real strength completely hidden. The Ghost Army participated in over 20 battlefield deceptions across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Germany. One of their most successful operations came during the crossing of the Rhine River in March 1945. While the real Ninth Army prepared to cross at one location, the Ghost Army set up a fake buildup at another, complete with dummy landing craft, fake radio traffic indicating an amphibious operation, and sound effects of a massive force preparing to assault across the river. German artillery opened up on the fake positions, wasting ammunition on rubber tanks and empty fields. Meanwhile, the real crossing met lighter resistance than expected because German forces had been drawn away to counter the phantom threat. What's fascinating is how seriously the Germans took these deceptions, even when they started to suspect something wasn't quite right. There are intelligence reports where German analysts noted inconsistencies, questioned whether certain units were actually where they appeared to be, but they couldn't afford to ignore the possibility that the threats were real. That's the genius of military deception. Even when the enemy suspects they're being fooled, they have to respond as if the threat is genuine, or risk catastrophic consequences if they're wrong. The human element of these operations cannot be overstated. The men of these deception units were constantly at risk. They were often positioned close to enemy lines, sometimes ahead of actual combat troops, creating the illusion of a force that didn't exist. If they were captured, they had no special protection, and they had to maintain their deceptions even under fire. There are accounts of ghost army soldiers calmly setting up inflatable tanks while German artillery shells were landing nearby. They'd position their dummy equipment, make sure it looked right from the air, and then get out, hoping the enemy would waste bombs and shells on their rubber creations instead of finding the real units. After the war ended, the entire Ghost Army operation remained classified for more than 40 years. The men who served in these units went home, and they couldn't tell their families what they'd actually done during the war. Imagine being part of something so unique, so creative and effective, and having to keep silent about it for decades. Some of them took that silence to their graves, never speaking about their service even after the records were declassified. When the stories finally did emerge, historians began to realize just how significant these deception operations had been. It's estimated that the Ghost Army's operations saved thousands of Allied lives by drawing enemy fire away from real units and by causing German forces to make strategic mistakes based on false intelligence. These operations also represented a fundamental shift in how warfare was conducted. For the first time, deception wasn't just a tactical consideration, it was a strategic weapon. Entire units were dedicated solely to fooling the enemy. It required a level of creativity and unconventional thinking that traditional military structures weren't designed to produce. That's why they recruited artists and designers and actors. Because creating a convincing fake army required the same skills as creating a convincing stage production or advertisement. You had to understand sight lines, lighting, shadows, how things looked from different angles and distances. You had to understand human psychology, what people expected to see, and how to fulfill those expectations with fictional elements. Consider Operation Fortitude, the massive deception operation designed to hide the true location of the D-Day landings. This involved creating an entirely fictional 1st United States Army group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, and preparing to invade France at Pas de Calais. The Germans believed this fictional army group was real. They kept entire divisions stationed at Calais for weeks after the actual Normandy invasion, convinced that the real attack was still coming. That fictional army included some of the dummy equipment and techniques pioneered by the deception units. Inflatable tanks sat in English fields, positioned where German reconnaissance planes could photograph them. Fake radio traffic created the impression of a massive force preparing for invasion. The deception was so successful that even after Allied forces were firmly established in Normandy, Hitler remained convinced for weeks that it was a feint and the real invasion would come at Calais. The legacy of these ghost armies extends far beyond World War II. Military deception became a permanent part of modern warfare doctrine. Today's militaries employ sophisticated electronic warfare, cyber deception, and information operations that are direct descendants of what those artists and engineers accomplished with rubber tanks and loudspeakers. But there's something almost poetic about those original operations. In an age before computer graphics and digital manipulation, before drones and satellite surveillance became ubiquitous, a small group of creative individuals armed with canvas and paint and rubber managed to convince the most technologically advanced military of its era that entire armies existed where there were only shadows. They created something from nothing. They painted reality with fiction and made it believable enough that trained intelligence analysts, experienced military commanders, and thousands of soldiers accepted it as truth. They understood that in war, as in art, perception shapes reality. What the enemy believes is happening can be more important than what's actually happening. The men who served in these units didn't storm beaches or capture strategic positions. They didn't engage in dramatic firefights or heroic last stands. Instead, they worked in the shadows, creating illusions, spinning fiction into apparent fact. Their weapon was misdirection. Their ammunition was creativity. And their victories were measured not in ground taken or enemies killed, but in enemy decisions influenced and Allied lives saved. The story of the military unit that never existed is ultimately a story about the power of imagination in the most unimaginative of human endeavors. War is often seen as the realm of brute force, overwhelming firepower, and direct confrontation. But these ghost armies proved that sometimes the most effective weapon isn't a gun or a tank. Sometimes it's an idea, a fiction so well crafted that it becomes functionally real in the mind of the enemy. The military units that never existed saved real lives, changed real outcomes, and helped win a real war. They were ghosts, but their impact was anything but phantom. They were shadows, but they cast long darkness over enemy planning. They were fiction, but they made history. And for 40 years, almost no one knew they had ever been there at all.